miadna, od Luciftian cors to vaunzen, to oat gemicals larazud tofklo, odo cycle, zakar od zamliax, qua kosab obelison, yael ednas cycles.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we're so excited to discuss geomancy and an angelical psalter of calls with contemporary cunning man and professional geomancer, Dr. Alexander Cummins. What are angelic calls? How do you open and close geomantic divination? And what are angelical charms and some little discussed details of Enochian? Well, our next guest is one of the best people to ask, Dr. Alexander Cummins, contemporary cunning man, author, historian, and poet. Dr. Al's latest tome from Hadean Press is entitled Nazarth, Pillars of Gladness, or a Geomancer's Angelical Psalter of Calls. This is a treasure house of geomantic incantations. It has 19 keys that were received and wrought through a combination of spirit communications, dream incubation, ritual cut-up, and judicious co-editing, alongside tutelary shades and attendant spirits. So in this podcast, Dr. Al shares how this angelical psalter offers prayers for opening and closing rituals of geomantic divination. Dr. Al also shares about how this can help clear the potentially dangerous miasmas of halted shield charts, very important in geomancy. And Dr. Al also presents calls for directly working with the spirits, virtues, and materia of each of the 16 figures of Renaissance European geomancy to remediate deleterious conditions, to transmute obstacles, to stir and direct spirits, and also to galvanize blessings. Dr. Al also explores the roots of the so-called Enochian language and so much more. A big thanks, as always, to each supporter of the podcast on patreon.com/glitchbottle. It's because of you that the podcast continues to grow in new and interesting ways. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back Dr. Alexander Cummins. Dr. Alexander Cummins, thank you so much for taking the time and stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast again.
It's a delight to be back, Alex. Thank you for having me. It's always nice to chat with you about things I'm up to and things that we both find exciting and interesting. And I'm always grateful for your audience submitting, questions and helping contribute to an ongoing set of conversations.
I was thinking about this before we were recording, that you are always talking about how a magician should strive to create their own workable system for them. And here you are, geomancer, contemporary cunning man, with an angelic psalter of calls. So can you give us kind of the broad strokes about the genesis of this tome? How did this whole thing come about?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it very much came out of a necessity of my practice, which is something that I'm kind of patting myself on the back for now I say that. I hope I don't come across too smug about it. As a professional geomancer, I'm reading for clients as well as myself, as well as, kin and family and friends and things like that. And we've talked before about whatever divination system you're using. Ideally, you are not just describing what's going on. You aren't just flipping over the tower and being like, sucks for you. All right, bye. Right. You are also hopefully coming up with some means of remediating that which can be, down-regulated, or avoiding obstacles that can't be dealt with, or combating and battling those obstacles that you can't get round. And so this idea of the figures that fall, or the cards that fall, depending on or the runes that fall, depending on what kind of divination you're doing, hopefully give us a set of foreknowledges, as well as potentially offering an image of the situation. And I'm really fascinated by when a chart becomes kind of a talismanic image of the sets of conditions, the influences, the problems, the potential solutions, the blessings that can be nailed down. And so I talk about it a lot as getting behind the wheel of whatever pattern is currently present rather than being hit by the car of it. In geomancy terms, say a figure that's generally pretty destructive, like Cauda Draconis, falls in a significant place in the chart. We want to find some way that the client can use that destructive energy to break a bad habit or to deal with a crossed situation they might find themselves in, or destroy that haunted amulet that they haven't thrown out yet, rather than that destruction raining down on them in a way that they weren't expecting, finding things to do with these. And so the book emerges out of finding more useful incantations and parts of ritual to pull out the spellcraft from the reading, to pull out the sorcery from the sortilege, and to be able to equip clients with more tools to be able to work with what's around them in ways that are conducive to what they're trying to achieve.
Can you share a little bit about geomancy itself, which I know is a huge, huge topic, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if we're doing the broad strokes, this effectively involves a series of 16 figures that are used in order to divinize future events. This was also one of the most popular forms of divination during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. What can you tell us about the broad strokes, about this amazing system that you practice?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the bedrock of my geomantic practice comes from what we sometimes call European Renaissance geomancy, as you kind of put out. It was very popular at that time. It's a form of sortilege that utilizes an awful lot of the use and rules of astrology. It's sometimes said to be the sister of astrology itself. I think about it as dirt astrology sometimes. We work on sortilege and place rather than time, which is, as Proclus says, and Agrippa loves to quote, time is the motion of the celestial bodies. We don't do any astronomy. We don't look at where the planet Mars is in the sky, but we do understand Mars's presence on the Earth through the 2 of the 16 geomantic figures that it rules. European Renaissance geomancy comes to us through Arabic geomancy, Ramel. My accent is terrible, I apologize. And this is itself incredibly popular and comes in somewhere around the 10th, maybe 11th century into Europe, and various Arabic diviners and theorists and as well as merchants bring it into Europe as well as into Africa, and it becomes especially popular as an influence in West African divinations as well. We can very much think about it, as the work of these 16 figures. The figures themselves look a little bit like a chibi miniature version of the I Ching. The hexagrams of the I Ching, as hopefully people will have at least seen in passing, are 6 lines, hence hexagram. And they're referred to as broken or unbroken, and they refer to patterns of energies that get called yin and get called yang. Geomancy does a very similar thing with 4-line figures. They can be thought of as quattrograms, I guess we could call them. And as such, they are, if we're going to go mathsy about it, they are 4-bit binary figures. And therefore, the way that the maths plays out of single and double dots, you can have 16 different answers, these figures. And the figures are considered to be fueled or powered or to partake in some of the energies and instantiations of virtue and spirits of the planets, as well as the 4 classical elements. Geomancy is incredibly elemental. It's called geomancy, it's said by at least early modern Europeans, not because it deals only with the earthy stuff, like 1/4 of the 4 classical elements, but because it deals with things in the world. The geo of that refers to worldly things. And so it's very elemental, it's very planetary. It can be consulted in a number of different ways. We can talk about some of the ways that these figures are generated, but they are set in a chart. We don't generally just throw one figure. We'll set a whole chart, which gets called a shield because it is shield shaped. And this can be thought of as a 15 or even 16 card spread. Like we may be familiar with the past, present, future classic 3-card spread of cartomancy. Geomancy has a 15-card spread. The first 12 of those places are assigned to the houses of the heavens, Vita, Lucra, Fratres, etc. They give us where to look about the tiny moving parts of a particular situation. And the last 3 figures, the last 3 places for figures in a geomantic shield chart are attributed to what gets called the court, the 2 witnesses and a judge. And this spits out a final answer for you, as well as giving you witnesses to show why that's the answer.
this is a totally false dichotomy, of course, but someone out there might be saying, okay, well, there's divination, and then separately there's engagement with spirits and angels. But you say, and I'm looking right here on page on the introduction, you say in your tome that, quote, the historical record on angelical geomancy holds at least one explicit example of the combination of geomancy with the angelical language, indeed, the proper celestial script of the angelical tongue in the form of a figure who's familiar with many people, of the angelical geomantic letterism attributed to Dr. Rudd. Can you share a little bit about the relationship between geomancy and angelic language and angelical geomancy?
Sure, yeah. So the manuscript that we're referring to there, it falls in a particular manuscript, is Harley MS 6482, which we're very fortunate to have had a treatment on by Adam McLean. His a treatise on angel magic is explicitly about this grimoire. The geomantic stuff it's not extensive. I should point that out straight away. It's a table that's found within that is giving correspondences of the angelical letters. We'll get into what we mean by that in a minute. But not only did Dr. John Dee and various scryers channel a language of supposedly of the angels, they also channeled the alphabet that it's meant to be written in. And so this grimoire takes us through the individual letters, just like in a Hebrew-derived gematria. We may see, the various Hebrew letters assigned to not just numerical values, because, maths and algebra and various things like that have been around for a good while, but also to more abstract concepts. This is, again, what is later going to inform, Hermetic Kabbalah's take on tarot and associations with particular letters, meaning more abstract concepts as well. And so this little example in a grimoire that is not just one single system, but contains a variety of things that we might also find in what we often call working books, which are the more like personal spell books of various spirit workers and wise women and local wizards referred to as cunning folk. And so there is a little bit of this kind of material in there as well, these notes to self, we might say. These characters of the 16 figures of geomancy expressed in the great and lesser squares of the tabula sancta, the holy table or the great table, which is an important part of ritual furniture, we could say, or forms the central altar of an awful lot of the magics that get called Enochian, the systems and the approaches and the techniques that are developed by Dee and his various seers, mostly Edward Kelly.
Can you share about these 19 keys? Because they were received through a combination of things: spirit communications, dream incubations, ritual cut-up. How did you first decide or discover this approach in terms of using a specific combination of things in order to discover or receive these 19 keys?
Sure. I think if I say trial and error, I'm not trying to be overly humble or, on the other hand, make a humble brag about like, this was really hard and it took me ages and you should all, bow down about it. No, it emerged out of a variety of ways that I have more formally ritualized my geomantic casting to be accurate and also to provide, again, not just a snapshot of what's going on, what are the whorling coherence of influences going on and what are the discords in there, but also what to do about them. As well as ritualizing divination also allows more options and modalities of work to clear problems that may emerge just from looking at problems. So I will steal, we might even say, a lovely analogy from my excellent friend Jesse that I do my podcast Radio Free Golgotha with. He pointed out that a lot of the time diviners are taking a sample of what the client is currently going through, and their charts, their altars, their spreads are kind of like a petri dish for growing the culture of that sample, of letting it grow under a microscope and taking this magnifying glass of good, clear divination and kind of zooming in and seeing what the specific problems are. But that also means that when you finished your reading, you're left with a petri dish full of a bunch of the client's, business, both good and bad. And so ritualization also provides extra means of being able to safely dispose of that stuff and have a clean working surface for when you need to, for example, see a client in 5 minutes, another client. It emerged from a very practical and necessary part of my professional work, really. Certainly the idea of prayers to open divination, if not to close it as well. The mainstay of the 19 calls that Nazath contains are for more directly working with, stirring, cohering, and even sending out the spirits and virtues that cohere around the forms of the geomantic figures themselves, of being able, when, say, a martial figure like Pua, the young boy, turns up, being able to find something useful for that young braggadocio martial energy to do, like, say, protecting your house or your place of business. So prayers emerge to be able to appeal to the spirits that themselves are attracted when that figure falls, to be able to be like, hey, here's a job for you.
Dr. Al, I never thought of it this way, but when we think about ceremonial magic, for example, the after process, after the actual evocatio part of the ritual, there's a license to depart. Things are very formalized. But when it comes to divination and geomancy, when I think of, someone reading tarot cards or looking at an astrological chart or a geomantic operation, I always think, oh, well, that's the result. And then what happens afterwards, though? And this is so fascinating that this is a ritualization of, a very safe way to dispose and harness that potency afterwards. What a fascinating thing. That's great.
Yeah. It's also worth, I think it's an important question for any diviner, and again, to explore for themselves in their practice. Who is speaking when you divine, when you flip those cards, or when you set those figures, or when you cast those runes, or what have you? Who are you appealing to? Is it the divine creator of a specific tradition's take on what God is? Is it a more nebulous concept of just like the biggest outer shell of the animist Matryoshka doll, right? Is it a particular set of spirits you're working with who you're asking to help you divine? And in that assistance for clarity and accuracy, are they speaking directly through the cards, or are they, my experience is a lot more in the way I work, at least, that my, various tutelary spirits that I work with kind of gather at my shoulder and read with me. They aren't speaking directly through the chart, but they are pointing out areas of the chart I should pay more attention to. So not just who is speaking when you divine, but who are you divining with?
Dr. Al, from the first time that I even heard the title of your Psalter, it was so captivating, Pillars of Gladness. And you share a little bit about the title for this and how it was named after a specific section from the fifth key. Can you give us a little background in terms of where the title for your tome comes from?
Yeah, this is one of the oldest bits of the Angelical language in one of the calls that I have used as a kind of versicle. We're used to thinking about versicles as an extract from a scriptural passage or from a psalm especially. And they often are incipits. They're often the first line of the psalm, which has some practical dimensions of itself. If you've got a pentacle that you're trying to inscribe, a blessing of God's victory on anyone who bears it, you might not have the space to write the whole psalm out. So you write, a section of it, an extract of it, the most relevant part of what you're doing, right? I had been using this little versicle from the fifth key, which in a lot of spiritual baths that I've been doing for a very long time, before I poured it over myself, I would recite this short little extract of one of these greater keys or incantations, which translates as, I have fastened pillars of gladness 19 and given them vessels with which to water the earth with her creatures. And in the language that gets called Enochian, that's Amipsi Nazath Af Od Deluga Zizop Zalida Kaoski Toltogi. And so I'd been saying that over bats before, pouring it over myself to try and, align with that sense of not just gladness as a oh, I'm happy about this, nice piece of cake I'm eating. Although the spiritual value of cake should not be undervalued here. But the idea of gladness as spiritual joy that refreshes and revitalizes us and returns us to feeling new and capable of engaging with both wonder and clarity at and in the world, which is always the thing I'm hammering on about, that hopefully sorcery helps us be more in the world and be more our better, if not our best selves, rather than something we retreat to just in our spirit rooms or just as a strange distraction,
such a lovely and resounding call for the practicality and kind of the Malkuthian application of this. And now that you've shared so much background, I know there are listeners out there who are wondering, okay, what do these keys sound like? Is there a key that you could perhaps recite for us and offer some context around?
Sure, yeah. Well, people have a lot of strong opinions about Enochian and about Angelical, both the systems and the language itself. And one of the things that I'm always wary of is the number of magicians I've come across who are like, I don't mind people using Enochian, but I would like to know what's being said at me and what spirits are being called. I don't really want to be part of something that I'm not clear on. So I wanted to offer you, because we talked about the opening prayer, the prayer of beginning divination, which I use for my geomancy, especially, when I'm reading for myself and often you need a lot of extra clarity to read for yourself. I don't know a professional diviner who doesn't go to other people about their stuff sometimes just because you're so close to it. But I wanted to share the opening prayer because that seems apt. We were talking about the importance of opening and things like that and ritualizing that. Sure, yeah. So the prayer itself in the English, as I wanted to do that first so people have an idea of what's being said at them. This is also a wonderful part of the angelical language. There are words that are incredibly short that are translated into incredibly complicated concepts. The first line of this, agedko, sometimes pronounced agedko, is translated as, with humility we call thee, with adoration of the Trinity. Like, that's one word, right? And Angelical provides these fascinating insights into where a very complicated concept can be expressed very, very simply. So the first line is, with humility we call thee, with adoration of the Trinity. In the name of the Creator, show yourselves as pleasant deliverers, as unto partakers of a secret wisdom of your creation, with the ark of knowledge and with ornaments of brightness, such as work wonders, furnishing powerful understanding to dispose all things. Open the mysteries of your creation, move and speak the contents of time as pleasant deliverers, conclude us as receivers of your mysteries. I have found that reading them in a language you understand and can track and follow also has some effect and some benefit as well. So the prayers included in the Psalter are in both the full angelical script, the anglicized angelical language, and in English themselves. So the prayer, this opening prayer, is referred to as the Ark of Knowledge, or in the angelical Yadna. It goes like this. Agedko, do oia qua al zamran obelison. Pogo play ananael quaan Yadna od luciftayan cors ta vaunzern to oat gemikals larazud tofklo odosikle zakar od zamliax qua kosab obelison yael ednas sikles.
Oh, you can feel the heavy punches of that. There is a weight, there is a certain gravity of that. Dr. Al, something that comes to mind is the angelical, specifically English tradition in Europe. Something that's been pointed out, I believe, by Dr. Skinner and others, is when you look at D and Rud and the Janua Magica Reserata and the 9 angelic keys of Rud, there's a similarity of language, like the true servants and worshipers of the same your God. And in the Ark of Knowledge here, as unto partakers of the secret wisdom of your creation, another one of those phrases that dips into that tributary. As you were receiving this, as you were going through this process, did it feel like you were connecting to part of this lineage, if that word could be used? Did it feel like you were stepping into a fast-moving celestial stream and discovering some of those similarities of language?
It very much did. It very much did. And I think this raises two really important points. One is that I don't want to take anything away from he said, starting ringing alarm bells already. I think we should acknowledge the great ingenuity and magical ability and insight and wisdom of Dr. John Dee. But we also, in praising his accomplishments, there is a potential to put him on a pedestal and to treat his work with this exceptionalism that belies how much of a broader and deeper set of magical, like cultural context of things that are going on around it. He didn't come up with this in a vacuum, is my point. He did amazing work, but the idea of using a showstone is somewhat unique in bringing in what was, previously considered the kind of thing that the model equivalent would be, people with psychic reading neon signs outside their doors, right? But he was bringing this like low class way of divining into the upper echelons of courtly magi and trying to speak to angels through this thing, which is not unusual either. He starts with prayer to Michael, a crystal ball, and a lot of patience, right? These are not unusual things. So the fact that his language and the language that the angels are sharing with him has these features that we find in other grimoires, it makes a lot of sense when we understand that at various points, angels say, we don't need to give you a new sigil. You already have one in your library. Go and check that book. You can use that one, right? They are themselves not just saying, throw out all your books. We're going to give you the full download and it's going to be nothing like you've ever seen, right? There are developments going on. And D, again, is admirable for a number of reasons, but for being able to synthesize and channel a new set of doing things out of some of the extant things, right? I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. The second thing in terms of like, as I was putting it together, is that the angelical language that we have from the various calls that Dee receives and channels and so on, which is a laborious process of pulling them out of these large tables that look very much like cryptography, which many scholars and Enochian magicians have pointed out, this makes sense because Dee is also a cryptographer. And so, angels are going to speak to you or spirits are going to speak to you in a way that you understand and can get into. It's not a huge vocabulary in the context of things. I joked speaking on another podcast recently that there's no word for love, but there's like 3 words for through thrusting fire. And so when you start utilizing the language that we already have, you are inevitably entering into that mindset via the words that we have and don't have. And so I absolutely felt, very keenly, and that's part of the reason I was using this language, that it was being responded to by, I work with an awful lot of dead magicians and an awful lot of early modern dead magicians at that. There was a lot of like, oh, someone's using that again. Not that I'm, consider myself the only one doing this work or anything. There are many awesome Enochian magicians doing all sorts of traditional and innovative work with it, of which I'm but one. But yeah, it definitely felt like entering into the stream of things. And I'll say that the points that it really felt like that in some of the less times when it was less me co-editing with various spirits at my shoulder and a lot more like things being beamed straight into my head were words that I couldn't find in any dictionaries. And I was very wary about including those. And so I don't think any slipped in the end. I tried to keep it very traditional. But when these spirits start giving you new words, that to me was like, oh, this is very interesting, especially when those words, Enochian loves compound nouns. And so when those words are made up of other words that you do know are real, but are being combined in ways that are new to you, at least, that for me felt like, yeah, I'm hitting something genuine here.
I suppose I'm thinking of Gilbert and Davies in an interesting way, because one of those things in an excellent book, The Art of Magic, is this concept of spiritual landscapes and imagery and traversing specific topographies. I mean, did you get a sense of a specific layout or a kind of esoteric space that as you were announcing these calls and literally translating these calls, that it was spotlighting something perhaps, or casting a light on a spiritual landscape?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up, this idea of like visionary topologies and the spaces of things. Yeah, this is partly what my work in Geomancy has also been kind of highlighting for me over the last couple of years, that I think of the forms of the figures as being these kind of haunted doorways or these muster points about which or through which various spirits and energies can kind of instantiate or gather or cohere or dissipate in some cases. And so thinking about the figures as places where things happen, places where spirits are, as opposed to just spirits themselves. And I don't want to say that kind of spirit work isn't valid. I know several geomancers who work with the spirit of Amicio, for instance, and for them it's a singular entity. For me, it's a lot more about, it's often more about the legions, right? Each of the figures contains various spirits that align with what the figure is about. And so these things that ended up being called like these treasure houses of the geomatical images included in these calls was exactly about narrating a landscape or a place where you could meet these spirits. And that's also partly what informed my Geomancy Foundation course. The thing when I ask people and try and get feedback on how can I do it better, the thing that my students have all really responded well to, which I think speaks to this point about landscape and imaginal places, is an imaginary pub crawl. I take my students on in this kind of 10 hours of training in the fundamentals of geomantic divination, taking them through each of the 16 figures as if it were a bar of some kind. So Pua, the young warrior, can be described, I think, as like a sports bar full of, very broy dudes, knocking back drinks, wearing that, it's got sport on every channel. We can have a bit of fun with those kinds of things. We can talk about Cauda Draconis, that destructive figure, as not so much a bar as the crater where a bar burned down, for instance, things like that. And we can have fun in their ways of getting mnemonic devices in place, of like being able to associate them. There's literally the art of memory, right? Method of loci is all about treating memories and information like it's a physical place that you can wander, or at least a topology that you can wander around your memory palace in. So partly it's just fun, and I think learning should be fun. It often helps us. And again, that notion of gladness and spiritual joy at something that nourishes our soul, as well as is just like ticklish or feels good in the moment. But I think this is again speaking to the idea of understanding the figures as places where spirit work happens, as opposed to just the face of a particular spirit. So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. It was definitely a thing that I found emerging and was like, oh, that's neat.
Can you share also about how, Pillars of Gladness, it presents an approach to angelical charms? Charm has so many different meanings. Can you share with us a little bit about the employment of angelical charms in this specific tome?
Sure, yeah. So the kind of two things about this are, getting at what the language is meant to be used for, which the various spirits that get called Enochian or Angelical that come to D and his various seers are pretty explicit that this is not just a language to sit in some books. It's meant to be used. The way it's talked about frequently is as a medicine of some kind, as a thing that remediates things, a thing that doesn't just describe the world but changes it. We can get into more of the specifics of that, but I'm fascinated where, again, the image of the thing can be used as a talismanic point for cohering the virtues of the thing. And so the idea of setting angelical script painting it onto a plate, as we might paint or write out psalms in wine on a glass plate and then wash it and give it to the patient to drink after they've prayed it. That's a very typical folk magical use of the psalms as a charm of some kind. So written charms in the angelical script, as well as in the language, written in English, I've found to be effective for various things. And again, this idea of operationalizing the medicine of this angelical language, which is said to be understood by pretty much everything in creation.
To that very point, Dr. Al, can you share a little bit more about the praxis? So for example, you have these amazing calls, and when people start opening up the Psalter in whichever language they choose to engage in, what kind of praxis is involved? So for example, astrological timing or planetary hours, or perhaps different incenses being employed before a call is recited. Is there anything that you found as you went through, or any advice that you might have for how people should best approach these calls within the context of geomantic divination?
Yeah, absolutely. So the three calls that are really about opening, closing, and clearing problem charts, should we just call them that for the time being, what get called halted charts? And we can get into that if you want. Those three are pretty much plug and play. You're about to start divination, you read Yagna. You're closing. The prayer is a prayer of gratitude, actually, of saying thank you to all the spirits that gathered here and helped me have clarity and things like that. The 16 calls that are for cohering and working with the spirits and virtues of the figures themselves kind of assume that the figure is already in front of you in some way. And I have found while they can be used open-handed, They work way more effectively when you're either trying to find out more about what a figure is about in a chart. So this particular figure has fallen as a judge. I'm not sure what that means in this context. It could mean a couple things. You might recite the call over it and ask it. There are lines in the calls that say, by your stars on the earth, which is about marking the point of the figure. And so even if you haven't done a chart, you can also use these figures for more operative geomantic figural spellcraft. And with that, I still recommend that people chalk or otherwise mark the form of the figure in front of them, because this gives the spirits that are cohering some kind of container or tangible. If I say container, I don't mean like trapped in there, but it gives them a muster point. And this is, I've found also the case with saying these over materia that you're going to use, like the dried herbs that you're about to use in a bath or in a suffumigation or to put in a charm bag or something, that it stirs something in them and imbues them with those virtues and the blessings of those spirits by a kind of contagion.
We do have a listener question from Wilma Matthey. And Wilma is asking and saying, I'm so excited for the good doctor to be returning. Me too, Wilma. I totally agree. Wilma says, my question is, what the heck is a halted shield chart? I haven't gotten my hands on Dr. Al's tome, but I will, and everyone else should too. Excellent advice, Wilma. But Wilma says, I would appreciate any more information, Dr. Al, that you have to share.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I'm glad this was asked. Thanks, Wilma. And thanks for the really kind words. Gosh, I'm very English. I don't really know how to deal with that. So I'll jump straight to the thing you asked. Yes. So the term halted, I think I want to give credit where it's due. And I think it's a term that our good friend and friend of Glitch Bowl, Sam Block, master geomancer and all-round excellent human being, I think he coined the term. There is a concept in geomancy, which in brief is that if certain figures fall as the first thing marked in a reading, and again, I feel that's significant that they are marked, it can connote that we should abandon the reading. The two figures that we find in European geomancy specifically that say that we should not just stop the reading, but abandon it and potentially even destroy the chart that we started to make, which again, like the image magic of this is really fascinating to me. The two figures are Rubius, which is a martial figure of, poisoning, vice, sin, not in the sense of some sanctimonious priest pointing a finger at you, but the things that we know are destructive that we might engage with anyway. It's very much a figure of deceit and like self-deceit as well. And so when it falls as a first figure in the chart, it's often said to connote that there is a level of deceit and self-deception around that means it's not useful to do the reading at this time. The other figure that some say you should abandon a reading if it falls as the first figure is Cauda Draconis, that one we talked about before, the dragon's tail, the figure of destruction, I guess would be the easiest way of putting it, which is ruled by both the malefic planets of Saturn and Mars. And some geomancers won't read if that's the first figure that falls. I will, because I don't think it's not that it's a bad thing, right? And again, I hope I don't have to bang too hard on about how the idea of like hashtag good vibes only is not useful for a diviner to do, right? If something's wrong, I want to know what's wrong and do something about it. I'm not benefited by ignoring it, right? The issue for me with the two figures that potentially halt charts is not that they're bad. And again, if it's just bad news, I want to hear that bad news. I might not like it, but I'm going to find it valuable. It's the notion of maddening and self-deception that comes with Rubius when its red alert sounds at the beginning of a reading, that I will halt it. I will switch to another set of sticks of tools. We will do a short divination on why that's fallen and less why it's fallen, more on what to do about it, which is typically just a salt bath. And then I'll reschedule for the following day. And sometimes that's because the client has been involved in some spicy business. Sometimes it's that they have in fact pissed off some spirit, or they've been disrespectful in a graveyard and something's followed them home, or they're currently engaged in some really serious and hot and heavy curse work that might be entirely justified. Mine isn't a moral judgment on them, but it is that geomancy says not every time is appropriate or useful to ask every question. And so we have to kind of roll with that and see what's up. Sometimes a Rubius will fall and the client hasn't done anything to deserve it. And I haven't done anything to deserve it. It's just that for whatever reason, now is not a great time to ask that.
We do have a listener question for you, Dr. Al, from Kate Crane. Kate is wonderful. And she asks and says, Dr. Al, Thank you for considering a 101 question. I'm fascinated by Enochian magic, but I also find it overwhelming. Could you please suggest a couple of points of entry?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no. Firstly, I also still occasionally find the corpus of things called Enochian magic a little bit overwhelming. It's a very complicated set of things. D is channeling by, depending on the scholar or the practitioner you speak to, 3, 4, 5 different kinds of interlocking systems and approaches and sets of spirits and tools for dealing with them. So firstly, if you aren't a little bit overwhelmed by it, I'm not sure you're paying proper attention. So that's the first thing to say, is it is overwhelming. It's important to look at what D did, I think, to get an idea of where this falls, what the sequence is. And obviously a historian is going to say, well, the history of the magic is as important as the magic itself. Of course, we're going to say that, job security, etc. But I think genuinely looking at some of the historical materials, which are readily available and excellently edited and glossed in some cases, to get at what D did, not because we want to recreate what he did necessarily, but in understanding where all this stuff came in, like what order, when, that kind of thing, to be able to distinguish, what's the stuff from the text that gets called, or the system that gets called Liber Lagoath, what's the stuff from the system that gets called the Heptarchia, what's the stuff that's the ritual equipment, what's the stuff that's mostly about the language and the calls, what's the keys of the gates, which starts to bring in some like Christian Kabbalah to this kind of thing. Where does like a general early modern apocalypticism come into this kind of business? These are things that we can read for ourselves. And so I would definitely recommend, if folks are interested in looking at this material, Joseph H. Peterson's John Dee's 5 Books of Mystery, which will lay out in nice big text what he did. It's going through his diaries and the journals of his spiritual investigations, we could say. So that's a really good one if you want to get a handle on like, where does all of this fit together? And if you're interested in jumping off, especially with the more visionary techniques of scrying, which is a huge part of what Dee was doing and forms the basis of many forms of magics called Enochian, then honestly, I found Lon Milo Duquette's Enochian vision magic really helpful. He got a little bit of stick from some magicians for suggesting that, if you can't get a ring made of solid gold, then maybe you can make one out of other materials and see how that works and at least practice with it, which some people were like, no, it has to be proper gold and nothing else. But I found it very helpful for getting an idea about what this stuff means and laying it out in Lon Milo Duquette's typically, very accessible way. I find that a useful one to recommend for people just trying to get started with actually trying to do some of this stuff.
We also, Dr. Al, have a listener question for you from Isaiah Sun, who is asking, Dr. Al, I hear lots of information surrounding Enochian, and in your book, you share about the so-called Enochian language having Adamical roots. What are these roots, if you can share broadly, as I've never heard it phrased like that, but I love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Al.
Sure, yeah. So this really gets to the core of, again, this point about like these spirits don't just dump this, dictionary of angelical words into Dee's lap. They also give some explanation as to what it is and what it's meant to be used for. And I would argue they are uncharacteristically clear. They're not always clear, right? You're trying to get an angel to talk to you about the nature of creation and God's mysteries. We shouldn't maybe expect it to be super clear and concise and easy to understand on the first try. But they repeat again and again that the language that they're talking about, this angelical language, this Enochian language, is a language taught in paradise, says the angel Ilamisi. It's taught by infusion to Adam, that it's the language spoken in the Garden of Eden by the first man and the first woman, supposedly. And when they start getting into this, the Archangel Gabriel has a bunch of things to say about this to Dee as well. He says that Adam not only did know all things under his creation and spoke of them properly, naming them as they were, but also was partaker of our presence and society, yea, a speaker of the mysteries of God, yea, with God himself. And so this idea that Adam didn't just give arbitrary names to all the flora and fauna of Eden, but spoke with them, and even, we could argue, swore with them, made deals with them, made agreements with them. And this doesn't just cover the animals, it also covers the plants and the places as well. And so I'm fascinated by the idea of this being an ancestral language, not just in terms of it being a language that emerges from some early modern English Welsh magicians, mucking about with crystal balls, but as a commonwealth for all living beings, potentially, if we take its mythic origin on the value that it claims it has. If we are going to work this thing utilizing the ritual precedents and the mythic historiola and the account by these delivering spirits of what this language is and what it's for, Adam names all things in this language, speaks to angels with it, speaks to God with it. And so this kind of lingua originale, this like first language or this natural language, is supposedly, by its own press at least, said to be something that all spirits can understand and are moved by. Now, does that mean that they like it? No, not necessarily. And it's said that hell will tremble when they know what is spoken to them. And I think about that especially in terms of demons are fallen angels. How would you feel if someone started speaking in the language when you were in paradise? What's that as a reminder? I'm fascinated by that kind of concept. So yeah, Adam speaks it. It's infused into him, as is all divine knowledge. I'm fascinated by Adam as first and common ancestor, especially in terms of how Dee is like Gilbert and Davies, the practitioners behind the excellent book of the Art of Magic, are men of the British Empire. Like it's said that Dee coins the term itself, and they're absolutely using these insights into the mysteries of God to proclaim that, God's on our side, and we're gonna bring about empire and all sorts of Edenic concepts around looking at the quote new world as a new Eden, except with all these indigenous people that happen to be living there. And so what I'm interested in, again, with getting to the grips of the angelical language as Adamical, is that it isn't just the preserve of imperialists. It isn't just another byproduct of empire, of colonizing the spirit world as well as the mortal world. It's hopefully something that all peoples have a legitimate heritage to, and thus can move us not just in the commonwealth of all people, but of all living things on the planet.
These kind of Adamical roots, this commonwealth of all living beings, is just such a lovely mingling, if you will. I mean, it just seems like all of the pistons are firing on all cylinders there. That's lovely.
An elder who has since passed from the mortal world of Enochian magician Benjamin Rowe, who published as Joshua Norton sometimes, he makes this excellent point in his Enochian magic reference book that the magic's called Enochian. And I keep using that term because I want to be clear that there are a lot of things that get called that. And so I'm not here to say that counts and that doesn't. But he says that there's a real bare bones nature to the original Enochian material. And magicians have to improvise extensively to make it an effective general purpose magical system. He says the history of the system's use is a history of innovation. And despite how readily historical materials and the materials of literal cryptographers and some of the smartest people around at their time is going to produce an awful lot of necessity for scholarly methodology, and that's also going to produce a number of us having very firm opinions about it and, potentially bickering in various magical forums about what it is and isn't. We need to acknowledge that, like, working this and finding how we can apply it isn't a betrayal of some inalienable dogma. It's a way of again, breathing hopefully fresh life on these old and vital and hallowed bones.
We do also have a listener question for you, Dr. Al, from Jabril Jama, who is asking and saying, "Hello there, Dr. Cummins. I recently started learning about geomancy, and I'm wondering, could you please give us your overall explanation of this system as you yourself use it? I see so many various traditions, and I'd love your usual and lucid explanations. Thank you." And just to add, Dr. Al, since you did share about the system, have you seen in any other systems this kind of amazing merging with the divinatory aspect and the kind of angelic calling or spiritual calling aspect?
That's a great question. I can definitely answer the first part in terms of where I'm coming from this stuff. I have a lot of time for the early modern geomancer and self-proclaimed Rosicrucian John Hayden. He writes the Theomagia, or the Temple of Wisdom, which is a book that combines an awful lot of angelology with his geomancy. He seems to be the basis for various techniques that the Golden Dawn will adapt, for instance, or will champion, like drawing a pentacle and then drawing the sigil of the spirit that rules the day that you do the divination in as an opening rite. It's Hayden that says geomancers should employ various rituals and ceremonies to work their divination, because this itself is a kind of magic. We are appealing to these cosmological forces to understand how reality is unfolding. And as such, this is absolutely wrapped up in his angelology and in his animism, I would argue. A very Christian crypto animism, but like one nevertheless acknowledges that there is a creature responsible, or an angel responsible for various kinds of patterns and things like that. So I'm a big fan of Hayden, who is also, I would not suggest that the Temple of Wisdom is an easy first book to get into. It's written in the 1660s and it shows. He's also infamous for just cribbing whole, not just chapters, but whole like sections, like several chapters in a row from Agrippa and various other sources. He's often called idiosyncratic by many historians of magic. He's not well liked necessarily, and he does come across as something of an aristocrat who is maybe getting excited and going off on too many tangents. I'll say that, to be generous to his shade. I come from that. In terms of an overall explanation, I've been opening my divination with a call with the prayer of the gnomes for a good while, and also with the Astrakios prayer from my Grimorium Verum practice originally. I used the prayer of the gnomes. I may have banged on about this to you before, actually, Alex, on this podcast. I like the prayers of the elementals because they aren't just praying to these earth elementals to turn up and help us divine properly about what's going on in the world. I describe them as more like going to church with these elementals, because you are praising their deity. And in the case of the gnomes, it is the invisible king beneath the earth who helps us pull the pearls of wisdom up from the depths into the light, where the seeds of the stars have been buried in the sublunary realm, and that he never withholds the wages of his workforce, that this fair, very Pluto-type figure is present as the thing that the gnomes pray to. And so you go to church with them to face the same direction, to be like, yeah, we have these shared values. We agree in clarity. We agree in hard work. We agree on not being vague about things. We agree about precisely tracing what happens under the moon in the sublunary world, where all our stuff is, where our bodies are mostly, by understanding what's already been imbued into the earth, rather than waiting for particular conjunctions and configurations. And the other prayer I use extensively is the Astrakios prayer, which is about pulling in spirits that, as far as I can tell, are used in what the Verum calls the prayer of success, which is something you say at certain times of day leading up to an operation, as well as saying it during an operation. And as far as I can tell, they call in various spirits that just ensure that other spirits are talking to each other properly, and that they kind of lubricate processes and make sure that, in the case of the ritual of divination, that your spirits are talking to my spirits, are talking to the oracle spirits most effectively, with the least amount of like telephone game going on. I open my rituals with clients like that, and have done for a good while, and I find that very effective. Yeah. As for other systems that employ Enochian or angelical or divine kind of bases, I think when we get down to it, when we get into the myths and the spirits, to speak bluntly, that are being described by various systems of divination, that most of them have some kind of divine component to them that we can use that divination system to get at and to reflect on, explore, and build relationships with.
What else would you like listeners, Dr. Al, to keep in mind as they pick up a copy of your tome, Pillars of Gladness, and they start to go through it themselves for the first time? Is there anything else that we haven't discussed yet that you'd like to leave listeners with?
Oh gosh, that's a wonderful question. I mean, yes, there's a bunch of things I hope it does, right? I hope it provides, helpful ways of engaging more deeply with things. I wonder if there's going to be a sense of feeling that one has to collect them all. In some sense, that one has to rifle through the whole thing and read the whole thing to get the full system. And I don't find that to be the case. I don't know if anyone was thinking in those terms. But in my experience, when people start to do more spirit work with particular figures, they will gravitate to a couple, and that will help them work on what they're working on for now. So I would say, if a particular call stirs something in you, to sit and attend with that, and to not feel that you have to go through all of them. That said, there are calls for not just the figures that bring blessings, but also the figures that warn us when danger is afoot. If you spend all your time reading the Rubaeus prayer or even the Tristisia prayer an awful lot, you might want to balance that out by reading the Laetitia prayer or a prayer that clears bad conditions. The Halted chart prayer is a 3-part prayer that can be used not just when Rubaeus turns up, although mostly it's used for that, but also for clearing other stagnant or unhelpful miasmas. So I would say work with it at your own pace and don't feel you have to jump into all of it at once and understand what all 16 figures are saying to you. Then it's working out the signal out of the noise, so to speak. I would argue, try and work with one. And if you aren't sure which one to work with, maybe cast a geomantic chart about which of these calls is most useful for me to work with right now.
Can you share with us a little bit about some upcoming projects and also upcoming classes, and give us a rundown of all of the great things that you have going on?
The other major thing, other than I have classes on most Mondays at this point for the rest of the year on a variety of topics. And folks can find out about my upcoming classes week to week through my Linktree hub that I'll forward along to you if you don't mind sharing that, Alex. But the major other thing I've been doing is going through my recordings of previous classes and courses that I've taught through a variety of other friends' businesses and institutions and so on, and collecting those class recordings and bundling them up with additional resources, full scans of early modern texts, bibliographies, further recommended reading and things like that, and making them available for sale on my website as recordings. So most recently, my 3-part course that I previously taught through Wolf and Goat, a Goetia of the Four Kings Foundation, is now available to buy as recordings, as is my Geomancy Foundation, as the sourcebook series on Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, my foundation course on the 4 humors and their use not just in pre-modern medicine, but also in pre-modern magic, spirituality, and what we might call now like holistic well-being. I'm gradually putting up these classes in between keeping several other plates spinning and writing new books and seeing clients and my own ritual obligations as well. And so if folks want to reach out to me about courses that I've taught in the past, I mostly have all the recordings of them and I'll be putting them up over time, but I'm happy to make them available to people for private. I would just rather be able to exchange an email with someone. I like having a bit more of an idea about how I can help them get the most out of this material. I'll be continuing to put up a variety of courses on necromancy, grimoire study, an awful lot of stuff on geomancy and its particular applications in spellcraft and sorcery and spirit work, as well as divination, and cunning craft as well. I have another couple of things coming up on those kinds of folk magics of the early modern British Isles. I get them up when I can in between 12 other things. So again, if folks want to know about particular things that I'm doing, the easiest way is to reach out to me at consultantsorcerer@gmail.com.
Dr. Alexander Cummins is a contemporary cunning man, a professional geomancer, an author, a historian, a poet, among many, many other things. His latest tome from Hadean Press is called Nazarth, Pillars of Gladness, or a geomancer's angelical psalter of calls. Dr. Al, thank you so much. It is so lovely chatting with you always. Thank you so much just for sharing both your time and your wisdom again on the podcast.
Oh, bless you, Alex. And thank you to you and the community that you kind of helm and cohere around this podcast. Thanks, everyone. It's great to get to talk about this and to contribute to the discourse and to get to be gladdened by the conversation.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed that episode with Dr. Al as much as I did. His lucid explanations of what angelic calls are, as well as his insights into the linguistic process, is, as ever, so much needed and rejuvenating, especially how Dr. Al explains such a complicated topic so clearly. So please check out the links below to get your own copy of Pillars of Gladness. As always, a huge thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon. Glitch Bottle has no sponsors and no advertisers, only listener support each month at patreon.com/glitchbottle. Keeps the esoteric engines running and growing in new and interesting ways, with some exclusive content over there as well. So make sure to check that out. Much love to each and every Glitch Bottle patron, and for you listening. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to find your pillars of gladness, to uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.